At 8:00 in the evening on December 17, 1939, a deep blast rolled across the River Plate. People standing on the Montevideo waterfront flinched as a sheet of orange light jumped up from the dark water. A second explosion followed, louder, and then another. Windows rattled in nearby streets. Smoke rose fast and thick, and the smell of burning fuel spread along the shore. Out in the estuary, a warship burned in place, not under enemy fire, but by her own charges. And the strangest part was this: she had come out to fight. By the time this happened, World War II was only a few months old, and the fighting at sea already mattered to everyday life. Britain needed ships to bring food, fuel, and supplies across the ocean. Germany needed to cut those routes to weaken Britain without facing the Royal Navy head-on. Far from Europe, the South Atlantic looked like a wide, empty space where a single raider could hide, strike, and vanish again. That is why a German warship ended up off Uruguay, with crowds watching from a neutral city. Uruguay was not part of the war, but it could not escape the war's pressure. Its port rules, its courts, and its diplomats suddenly held the power to trap a modern steel ship. And for the sailors on board, the choice became simple and cruel. Leave and fight, leave and run, or destroy the ship with your own hands. The ship was the Admiral Graf Spee, often called a pocket battleship by the British. She was built to be a predator. She carried 6 11-inch guns in 2 triple turrets, one forward and one aft. Those guns hit harder and reached farther than the guns on most cruisers. She also carried smaller secondary guns and torpedo tubes, enough to punish any ship that got too close. She was large for a cruiser, fast enough to catch merchant ships, and strong enough to scare off many escorts. Her top speed was around 28 knots, and she had the range to stay far from home for months. She was meant to do one job well: hunt shipping, damage enemy trade, and force the Royal Navy to spread out and chase her. In the first months of the war, Graf Spee did exactly that. She stopped and sank merchant ships in the South Atlantic, taking crews aboard first so they would not die at sea. That made her captain stand out. His name was Hans Langsdorff. He was a professional naval officer, not a loud ideologue, and he followed the rules of war more closely than many expected from Nazi Germany at that moment. His record as a raider was brutal to British trade, but it was also oddly restrained toward prisoners. Still, the mission had a clock on it. The longer he stayed at sea, the more likely he would be found, and the Royal Navy did not need to win every time. It only needed to force the raider into a corner. In mid-December of 1939, that corner formed near the mouth of the River Plate, between Uruguay and Argentina. Commodore Henry Harwood had guessed where Graf Spee would hunt next, because the shipping lanes there were busy and rich with targets. Harwood waited with 3 cruisers, HMS Exeter, and the lighter cruisers HMS Ajax and HMS Achilles. Early on December 13th, the ships met in a running fight. Graf Spee's main guns hammered Exeter hard. Exeter burned, lost key systems, and suffered heavy casualties, but she kept firing. One of Exeter's hits mattered more than it seemed at first. It damaged Graf Spee's fuel system in a way the German crew could not fix quickly. It meant Langsdorff no longer had the freedom he needed. He could not roam the ocean with damaged fuel processing. He could not risk a long chase, and if he tried to run for home, he might not make it. After about an hour of heavy gunfire and many more hours of shadowing, Langsdorff turned toward a choice that looked safe on a map. He headed for Montevideo, the capital of neutral Uruguay, to land his dead, treat his wounded, and repair the ship. That is where the battle shifted. The guns fell silent and paperwork took over. In Montevideo harbor, Graf Spee sat close enough for the city to watch her. Her hull was marked and scorched. Work crews moved constantly. Welders, electricians, and damage control teams fought against time. Wounded men were carried to hospitals. Dead sailors were taken ashore for burial. The crew tried to act normal, but everyone knew the ship was trapped in a way that felt unreal. On board, daily life tightened into a routine built around repairs. Men scraped shrapnel holes, patched pipes, checked pumps, and moved ammunition. Others stood watch, eyes on the harbor mouth, listening for rumors. Some wrote quick letters they were not sure would ever be sent. Meals were eaten fast. Sleep came in short blocks because there was always more work and always more fear. Outside the ship, Montevideo turned into a stage. Journalists arrived. Radio stations talked non-stop. People gathered on shorelines and rooftops to stare at the German ship. It was a rare moment when a major warship sat close enough for civilians to see the war's machinery up close. Then the law stepped in. Under neutrality rules, a belligerent warship could not stay in a neutral port for long. Uruguay allowed Graf Spee more time than the usual limit, but not enough for major repairs. The deadline mattered. If Graf Spee stayed too long, Uruguay would have to intern the ship for the rest of the war. That meant the crew would be held, and the ship would be stuck in place, useless to Germany. Britain pushed hard to make sure that happened. British diplomats argued that Graf Spee was seaworthy enough to leave, because she had traveled far after the battle before reaching port. They also used the rules in clever ways to waste the German clock. Merchant ships were arranged to leave the port at intervals, triggering waiting periods that delayed Graf Spee's departure again and again. Every lost hour meant more stress inside the ship. At the same time, British signals and news reports helped build a dangerous story in Langsdorff's mind. The story said that a much larger British force was gathering outside the harbor, including heavier ships that would crush Graf Spee the moment she tried to break out. In reality, only one extra cruiser, HMS Cumberland, had joined Ajax and Achilles nearby. Stronger British forces were still far away, but Langsdorff did not experience reality the way a historian does. He experienced it through tired eyes, damaged equipment, uncertain fuel, limited time, and reports he could not fully verify. By the afternoon of December 17th, the choice narrowed to a thin line: leave and fight, leave and try to run past the British, or destroy the ship so it could not be captured, and so the crew would not die in what he believed would be a hopeless battle. Langsdorff chose destruction. The preparations were quiet and methodical because a scuttling had to be controlled to protect the crew. Secret papers were burned, codes were destroyed, some equipment was smashed or thrown overboard. Explosive charges were placed in key parts of the ship so that the hull and systems would be ruined. A skeleton crew remained to carry out the final steps, while most sailors were moved off the ship. As evening approached, Graf Spee weighed anchor and moved out of Montevideo, watched by thousands. The ship did not race out at full speed. She moved slowly, almost carefully, like a patient being led to an operating table. The sun dropped lower and the water turned darker. Offshore, British cruisers waited at action stations, guns trained, crews ready. Everyone expected a fight. But Graf Spee did not steer into open sea combat. Instead, she stopped near the boundary of neutral waters. Boats and barges came alongside. Sailors climbed down, carrying small bags, some carrying nothing at all. The last men left the decks. The last officers checked the final fuses. Langsdorff was not with the last crew at the final moment, but the order was his, and the responsibility stayed his. At 8:00 p.m., the first charge went off. The blast came from inside the ship, deep and sharp. A second blast followed, then more, as fire reached stored ammunition and fuel. Flames climbed high enough to be seen clearly from shore. Thick smoke rolled upward and drifted with the wind. The steel structure groaned as heat warped metal and shattered compartments. For the people watching, it looked like a victory, a defeat, and a disaster at the same time. There was no exchange of gunfire. There was no last stand on deck. There was only a warship being killed by its own crew in front of a neutral city, while enemy ships waited close by and did not fire a shot. The ship did not sink in the dramatic way many people imagine, because the water there was shallow. Graf Spee settled into the riverbed after burning, her superstructure still visible, smoke still rising, fire still eating through what it could. The explosions did not last long, but the burning did. For hours, she remained a bright, ugly mark against the dark water. On the boats carrying the German sailors away, the mood was mixed and heavy. Many felt relief because they were alive. Many felt shame because they had not fought again. Some were furious, convinced the ship could have broken out. Others had seen the damage and understood how thin their options had become. No one was cheering, and that is the heart of this story. Graf Spee looked like a ship that should have escaped. She had bigger guns than the cruisers outside. She had the speed to outrun some threats. She had a crew trained for battle, yet her captain still chose to scuttle her. If you were standing on that deck, and you believed a stronger enemy force waited outside, what would you do? Would you risk a battle that could kill most of the crew just to avoid the shame of retreat? Or would you choose the option that saved lives but destroyed the ship and your career? After the scuttling, there was no rescue effort in the usual sense, because the crew had already been removed. The urgent work now was about people, not the ship. Sailors were transporting across the river to Buenos Aires in Argentina, where they would be interned. Wounded men needed care. Officers needed to keep order and prevent panic or revenge. Langsdorff focused on one thing that still mattered to him: the safety and treatment of his men. He also carried the weight of how the world would judge what he had done. In Germany, the Nazi leadership did not reward failure. In Britain, newspapers celebrated the removal of a threat. In South America, people argued about whether Langsdorff had acted honorably or foolishly. The casualty numbers made the earlier battle hard to shrug off. Graf Spee had lost dozens of men in the fight off the River Plate, and many more were wounded. The British side had paid too, especially on Exeter. The fight had not been a clean victory for either side. It had been a brutal exchange in open water, followed by a tense standoff shaped by neutral laws and political pressure. Now the biggest question hung in the air: why did Langsdorff scuttle instead of using his firepower to escape? Part of the answer was damage that did not look dramatic from a distance. The fuel processing problem mattered because Graf Spee ran on diesel engines that needed clean fuel. Without that system working, the ship's endurance shrank. A ship that cannot travel far is not a raider anymore. It becomes a target. Another part of the answer was ammunition and readiness. Graf Spee had used a large amount of shells in the battle. She could still fight, but another major engagement could drain what remained, especially if she had to fight while also trying to break out. Fresh water was also an issue. Parts of her ability to make water had been damaged. That meant even basic needs became harder on a long escape attempt. Then there was time. Uruguay's deadline was real. If he stayed, internment was likely. If he left, he had to choose a direction and commit. And the direction out of Montevideo pushed him toward the waiting British cruisers. Finally, there was the problem of information. Langsdorff was told, and came to believe, that he faced a stronger British force than was actually present. Britain helped feed that belief by using radio traffic and public claims that larger ships were closing in. Langsdorff had to make a life-or-death decision while not knowing which reports were true. This is what made the River Plate aftermath so unsettling. It was not only a sea fight. It was a fight over rules, timing, and human judgment under pressure. And in that kind of fight, even a powerful ship could be pushed into self-destruction. So here is the uncomfortable comparison. Today, many people think of escape like a simple problem. You have a faster car, you take the open road. But at sea, in wartime, escape depended on fuel, repairs, the depth of channels, the reach of enemy scouts, and the laws of neutral ports. Graf Spee had firepower, but she also had limits, and those limits closed in around her. What would you trust more in that moment? The steel you could see, or the enemy force you were told was waiting for you in the dark? In the days after the scuttling, Langsdorff's story turned even darker. He went to a hotel in Buenos Aires. He wrote letters to his family and to German officials. In those letters, he tried to explain the decision as a duty. He believed he had saved his crew from an unnecessary death. He also believed he had to pay for the shame that would fall on the German flag because of the ship's loss. Not long after, he took his own life. He did it alone, after making sure his men were settled. He lay down on a naval ensign and shot himself. He was 45 years old. His death locked the story into a grim shape. A captain who destroyed his ship to save his crew, then destroyed himself to carry the blame. That ending is one reason Graf Spee's story still pulls people in. It was not a simple case of courage or cowardice. It was a case of a man making the least bad decision he could see, then being crushed by what that decision meant in a war that demanded victory, not careful judgment. In the wider war, the scuttling became a major public moment. Britain needed good news in the early months of the conflict. Newspapers and radio broadcasts presented the outcome as proof that the Royal Navy could hunt down German raiders. It mattered for morale across the Atlantic world, including in the United States, where people were still watching the war from the outside, but paying close attention to what it meant for trade and security. Germany, on the other hand, lost a valuable ship without losing it in open battle. That did not fit the image the Nazi state wanted. Reports and blame spread. Some argued that Langsdorff should have fought, even if it meant most of the crew dying. Others, including many outside Germany, saw the scuttling as a hard but humane act. The wreck itself did not vanish. Because the water was shallow, parts of Graf Spee remained visible for years. It became a strange landmark, half grave and half curiosity. Decades later, salvage work pulled pieces from the site. In the 2000s, a large bronze eagle from the ship's stern was recovered, raising new arguments about what should be displayed, what should be hidden, and what should be treated as a warning rather than a trophy. Today, the River Plate still looks calm most days. Ships pass through. The ports keep working. But the story of Graf Spee refuses to become just history because it highlights a kind of danger that did not require a direct hit. It shows how a modern weapon could be defeated by a mix of damage, law, misinformation, and a deadline. And it forces a final question that does not sit comfortably. If a captain believed his crew would die for no real gain, was his duty to fight anyway, or to stop the fight and accept disgrace? Graf Spee did not end in a glorious last battle. She ended in fire set by her own hands in view of a neutral city, while enemy ships waited for a fight that never came. Her guns were still there, her armor was still there, her power was still visible. But in war, power did not always decide the ending, because sometimes the most dangerous weapon was not the enemy's shells. Sometimes it was the story you believed about what was waiting beyond the horizon.